Hey, folks, welcome to the pre-show. Just a few seconds earlier than normal, but always 3 minutes before the airing of the show on the radio station over at Odyssey Radio. That's ODYSY radio.com. You can go over and hear I don't know, have you ever gone over there to check it out? If you're a listener to this show and you watch it pretty much over here, on the YouTube channel to see the video simulcast and to join the best chat room, go on over to Odyssey Radio. Again, spelled differently, ODYSY radio.com. And you can see all the other shows we have. We have Paranormal 411. We've got, of course, the Intrepid radio program. We've got the Seventh Rule, Paranormal Passages, Podcast UFO, Star Trek Universe, sci-fi, science fiction radio, the Odyssey Files, the Paranormal Gateway Paratalk, Into the Paranormal, Weird Darkness and Spaced Out Radio. So you should go on over. We've also got Bigfoot, Michigan, Rob, and Chill Pack, the Hollywood Hour, and Texas Front Porch. Those are just a few of the shows that are over here on Odyssey. I was going to say Subspace, but it's Subspace Odyssey Radio. And when this show starts to air at 3 minutes after the top of the hour, you can hear it over there. Just the audio only, no chat room, no visual, no nothing. So go on over and check it out sometime if you haven't already, and check out some of the other shows. So, boy, that's all I got to say about that. We got a few of you starting to gather, and when you want to, you can come on into the chat room. Again, this is just the pre-show. It's nothing to write home about. It's just getting us ready to go live. And I think we are all set. It looks like my mics are all up, and my video is up, and I have my drink. So, in my Celtic Pride tumbler right there, Celtic Pride. Boom, boom, boom. And tonight I am drinking an orange flavored hydration drink. What is it? Like Pedialyte, something like that. Hey, Matthew Sainsbury. I did not get a good shot of the Celestial event that took place in a different part of the country. It got a little dark here, but it didn't. We didn't have the whole thing. Hang on. We got to go dark. Going live. Stand by.
The Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent talk.
Hey folks, Scotty Roberts here. Welcome to the program, my program, the Intrepid radio program right here on Odyssey Radio. Go over to ODYSY radio.com. Hear the audio version of this show and the archives, and check out all the other shows that are over on the station. And also, you can watch this show in its video simulcast over here on my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Scotty Roberts, for those of you who aren't already in the channel. This is the best place to join us for the chat room, because if you join us via Facebook or Twitter, you're not going to see everything. You're not going to see everybody's chats, and you're not going to be seen by anybody. Just in those who are commenting over on those other platforms. You can also go over to my Patreon page, patreon.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. And you can find this show over there. I think it's Mr. Let me just check that. The only reason I started using the Mr. Scotty Roberts was because Scotty Roberts, believe it or not, is used by a lot of people out there. Nope, it's just Scotty Roberts. Patreon.com youtube.com/Scotty Robertson. If you want to help support this show, that's a good place to do it. Throw in a few bucks. And you can do the same thing here. You can become a member of this channel by hitting the little join button down below the window somewhere down there. And you'll be able to see different ways that you can become a member of this channel. All that does, it doesn't buy you much of anything. It helps you, or helps me, get support from you to continue doing this show and to expand it. Because we're not selling commercials. As soon as we get big enough to go commercials, you'll have more commercials than you want to hear. And then we'll still probably say you can donate to the show too. So there it is. Elderberry, good to see you. Matthew Sainsbury, of course, from Barbados. We got Sean Stroik is here. Sean Stroik says, hi, Scotty Roberts and Intrepids, the fellow Intrepids. They're all starting together. Josh Kemp is here. Yo, Josh. And who else we got? We got anybody else in the chat room right now? Chat room's a little quiet tonight. But there's still a bunch of you out there. I see the numbers. So you guys can all come in if you want to and join us. So, and by the way, if you want to help this show, if you aren't one to say, I don't want to throw any bucks into that because I listen to so many other things and everybody wants a piece of our wallet, don't they? I get the same thing. I actually support a few people on Patreon, just a few bucks a month because I enjoy their shows. And so a good way to do it without putting out any dollars, if you just don't have them to put into it. I know we all have different things that we can use our money on. Just spread the word. Let people know this show is here. Spread the link. And we get more listeners, and that helps us in the long run. So I appreciate it, folks, everything that you do. I appreciate your presence here. Means a lot. Sean says the clouds came in, but a good ring pick. Well, that's good. Yep, I didn't get one. It was cloudy and rainy here the whole day. So we didn't see much. We could have seen it, I think, even with a pin light box that you make out of a shoebox, you can still see the eclipse, even if it's cloudy, because the light is coming through. I believe I am correct on that. I'm not sure. Let me take a sip of this. So, we've been talking about King David. I want to kind of jump right into it because I've got a lot of material here. And you know me, I can rabbit trail us into running out of time because I have lots of things to talk about. And you just like I say, you put a nickel in me and I'll talk for 4 hours. So let's just get into it. If you're looking at the screen and you're seeing the video simulcast, that is my rendition of Goliath. That's an illustration that I did you see an ad for it in between this show and the Captain's Cabin every night. And you can see the ad for the Ancient Heroes trading cards. And this was the piece of art that I created for Goliath. I actually created Goliath, this drawing, 30 years ago, and then updated him for the cards. I updated his sword. I had a different sword in his hand. That's the beauty of being a digital artist as well. This was originally drawn by hand, but I was able to go into Photoshop and add the right kind of sword. This is a kepesh. And so I added that sword in Goliath's hand there, added the background. That is actually from a shot of the Valley of Elah, which is where the Bible says this story takes place. And it was this little valley, not very big. And the armies of the Philistines on one side, the armies of the Israelites on the other side. And Goliath would come down and taunt the armies. And by the end of 40 days, he was coming up the other side toward the army of Israel, taunting them. When David shows up on the scene. And so I want to look a little bit tonight at what was this story really like? What was it all about? Who was Goliath? We'll get into that a little bit. Maybe not so much that. I want to get into David because we're looking at David. We're going to talk about his origins. We're going to talk about where he came from. And what kind of origin story does he have? And is it something worth looking at? So here are tonight, we're going to talk about these mythical origins of the sweet psalmist of Israel, David is called, and also the giant slayer. Where did he come from? What's he all about? Let me get my chat room up here so I can hopefully keep an eye on some of the chats going on. So this is fascinating stuff to me. When you start digging into this history, I think it's really worth looking at because, as I always used to say, knowing history swings the door open and sheds light into a dark room, what would otherwise be a dark room. This is the beauty of archaeology, the beauty of anthropology, of ancient studies of mankind, and especially when it comes to these biblical stories. Hey, Grumpy Stack, he's alive! He's alive! It's good to have you here, living, breathing, rumpin', bumpin', Grumpy Stack. Nice to have you in the chat room tonight. So, very often in the Bible, a character's birth story is something that's anticipating and identifying his or her significance in the biblical writ. Isaac is the miraculous child of Abraham and Sarah's old age, the very embodiment of God's promise, and to make Abraham a great nation. Jacob emerges from the womb, clutching his twin brother Esau's heel, foreshadowing his life of trickery and usurpation. The infant Moses is saved from death by being hidden in a basket among the reeds of the Nile. And just as years later, he would save the Israelites from destruction at the Sea of Reeds, Samson's birth is announced to his mother by an angel, because Samson, the angel reveals, will be the one to defeat the Philistines. And a story for a different time, but it always struck me that Samson's greatest deed in his service to God was when after he was blinded, his hair was cut, and he's chained to the pillars, and he pushes down the pillars of the temple in Philistia and kills, it says, about 10,000. That sounds a little exaggerated because how would they all be in one building under one roof, but 10,000 Philistines that day, taking his own life. Now, how does that, I always wondered how God was glorified by the death of 10,000 people that were the earthly enemies of the earthly kingdom of Israel. That's a good question, isn't it? We'll look at that another day. So Samuel was the great prophet and the judge. He's born in accordance with Hannah's faithful prayer. And of course, Jesus is marked even from before his birth as conceived by the Holy Spirit and destined to redeem Israel from its sins. So given the litany of biblical heroes who are provided with all these great birth narratives, it's somewhat surprising that of David's birth, indeed his whole entire childhood, we know absolutely nothing. Nothing written about it. The Bible gives us only the barest facts. David's hometown is Bethlehem. The name of his father is Jesse. He's seven older brothers, only the first three of whom are named in the passage. The family profession is shepherding, and in short, David is a nobody. He's from a minor village in the then unimportant region of Judah, the youngest son of a man who has no claim to wealth or fame, a mere shepherd. His conception and his birth go unnoticed by any divine being, and even, it seems, by the Bible writers themselves. And at the same time, everyone loves an underdog, and David fits the bill perfectly. If someone with a background like David's could eventually become the great king of Israel, then it would seem that there's hope for all of us. But the Bible relates two stories of how the teenage David rose from his humble origins to the prominence in Saul's kingdom, as Saul's lyre player and as the slayer of the giant Goliath. These are the only two things out of his youth that were given about him. And these stories, you can find them in 1 Samuel 16 and 17. And they're the most famous episodes from David's life, though they resonate in different ways. And the first image of David, well, I might say the other great episode of David's life is the greatest sin he committed, and that was his adultery with Bathsheba and the murder of her husband to cover it up. So those are the three biggest things that people can pull out of David's life and be able to talk about them. So the first image of David to appear in the Bible is as a musician. He's a youth, and he's brought to King Saul's court to play the lyre and ease the king's troubled mind with his sweet music. And this is also the story with the longest afterlife, as David's youthful skill with the lyre is intimately connected in a popular imagination with his lifelong status as the author of the Psalms. Now, the Psalms weren't all authored by him, but bulk of them are attributed to David. Now, David is the quintessential lyricist, and he's perhaps just as famous for the songs that he wrote as for anything else he may have done. And after his death, David's authorship of the Psalms quickly became the defining act of his life. Now, David's connection to the Psalms, it was recognized and it was valued already in very ancient times. And at the end of his life, he recites a song to the Lord, recorded in 2 Samuel 22. And this song is none other than what we now know as Psalm 18. And according to Chronicles, David was the first to institute the regular singing of the songs to the Lord in the temple, which wasn't there. The temple hadn't been built before his death. But David was the first to institute the regular singing of songs to the Lord. And it took place in the temple, which was built by his son Solomon. Now, here is this song. I want to read this to you really quickly. Psalm 18. And this is out of the New International Version of the Bible. It's not a short psalm, but this is the song that he writes. And it's Psalm 18 for the director of music of David, the servant of the Lord. He sang to the Lord the words of this song when the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and from the hand of Saul. He said, I love you, Lord, my strength. The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. My God is my rock, in whom I take refuge, my shield, and the horn of my salvation, my stronghold. I call the Lord, who is worthy of praise, and I've been saved from mine enemies. The cords of death entangled me. The torrents of destruction overwhelmed me. The cords of the grave coiled around me. The snares of death confronted me. In my distress, I called to the Lord. I cried to my God for help. From his temple, he heard my voice. My cry came before him into his ears. The earth trembled and quaked, and the foundations of the mountains shook. They trembled because he was angry. Smoke rose from his nostrils. Consuming fire came out of his mouth. Burning coals blazed out of it. He parted the heavens and came down. Dark clouds were under his feet. He mounted the cherubim and flew. He soared on the wings of the wind. He made darkness his covering, his canopy around him, the dark rain clouds of the sky. Out of the brightness of his presence, clouds advanced. With hailstones and bolts of lightning, the Lord thundered from heaven. The voice of the Most High resounded. He shot his arrows and scattered the enemy. With great bolts of lightning, he routed them. The valleys of the sea were exposed, and the foundations of the earth laid bare at your rebuke, Lord, at the blast of the breath from your nostrils. He reached down from on high and took hold of me. He drew me out of deep waters. He rescued me from my powerful enemy, from my foes who were too strong for me. They confronted me in the day of my disaster, but the Lord was my support. He brought me out of into a spacious place. He rescued me because he delighted in me. The Lord has dealt with me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands. He has rewarded me, for I have kept the ways of the Lord. I am not guilty of turning from my God. All his laws are before me. I have not turned away from his decrees. I have been blameless before him and have kept myself from sin. The Lord has rewarded me according to my righteousness, according to the cleanness of my hands in his sight. To the faithful, you show you're faithful. To the blameless, you show yourself blameless. To the pure, you show yourself pure. But to the devious, you show yourself shrewd. You save the humble, but bring low those whose eyes are haughty. You, Lord, keep my lamp burning. My God turns my darkness into light. With your help, I can advance against a troop. With my God, I can scale a wall. As for God, his way is perfect. The Lord's word is flawless. He shields all who take refuge in him. For who is God besides the Lord? And who is the rock except our God? It is God who arms me with strength and keeps my way secure. He makes my feet like the feet of a deer. He causes me to stand on the heights. He trains my hands for battle. My arms can bend a bow of bronze. You make your saving help my shield, and your right hand sustains me. Your help has made me great. You provide a broad path for my feet, so that my ankles do not give way. I persuaded my enemies and overtook them. I did not turn back till they were destroyed. I crushed them so that they could not rise. They fell beneath my feet. You armed me with strength for battle. You humbled my adversaries before me. You made my enemies turn their backs in flight, and I destroyed my foes. They cried for help, but there was no one to save them. To the Lord, but he did not answer. They cried for help, but there was no one to save them. To the Lord, but he did not answer. I beat them as fine as wind-blown dust. I trampled them like mud in the streets. You've delivered me from the attacks of the people. You have made me the head of nations. People I did not know now serve me. Foreigners cower before me. As soon as they hear of me, they obey me. They all lose heart. They came trembling from their strongholds. The Lord lives. Praise be to my rock. Exalted be God, my Savior. He is the God who avenges me, who subdues nations under me, who saves me from my enemies. You exalted me above my foes. From a violent man you rescued me. Therefore I will praise you, Lord, among the nations. I will sing the praises of your name. He gives his king great victories. He shows unfailing love to his anointed, to David, and to his descendants forever. That is the high and mighty Psalm 18. And you may have learned parts of that in Old English. So what can I do for you, small child, who has come onto the radio show, even though I put up my hand to say don't come on? What's up?
I'm broken.
Yes, she is. She wanted to show you that, I think. She broke her wrist today. Oh, here, why don't you let me mess with that?
Well, you weren't doing it.
Yeah, well, you shouldn't be either. So there it is. So she broke her wrist right in here somewhere, her hand to her wrist. And so I think she just wanted to let you see that. Thank you for coming and showing us. Okay, I got to get on with this show. So I'll see you later. All right, bye. Scram.
Bye.
I love you. See ya. Ciao. Arrivederci. Let me get this put back where it's supposed to be. There we go. So there is the psalm that David wrote, and that's the one that it says was sung in the temple later, one of his psalms anyway. And so this whole psalm is all about David's experience. The words of the Psalter are introduced with reference to David. I'm sorry. And for David himself says in the book of Psalms, says Luke chapter 20, verse 42 in the New Testament, or far more frequently, simply David said or David declared. So these Psalms are attributed to him, and it has been the tradition in Israel for thousands of years. Now, David has become synonymous with the book of Psalms, just like Moses with the laws of the Torah, and Solomon with the wisdom of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. And the rabbis of the Talmud stated this outright. David wrote the book of Psalms. That's what the rabbis of the Talmud said about the book of Psalms. So should we doubt that? I don't think so. I think there was some attribution to David, but I think he did what the scholars of the Jewish religion thought he did. The equating of a biblical character with a distinct biblical corpus does more than simply attribute authorship. It defines the fundamental character and the character traits of that individual. And Moses, by being identified with the Torah, becomes the archetypical lawgiver, for better or for worse, depending on one's religious background. Solomon, for all of his many deeds as the king of Israel, is most widely known for his wisdom, as exemplified in the books associated with his name. And David, the connection with the book of Psalms, positions him as the ultimate model of faith and worship. And the Psalms, after all, have been recognized from antiquity to the present day as the most personal expressions of humanity's relationship with God. And they exhibit the full range of emotions, from anguish to rejoicing, from fear to security. And as John Calvin said, I've been accustomed to call this book, the book of Psalms, I think not inappropriately, an anatomy of all the parts of the soul. For there's not an emotion of which anyone can be conscious that is not here represented as in a mirror. That's what John Calvin said of the book of Psalms. So when the youthful David takes up the lyre in 1 Samuel 16 and soothes Saul's troubled spirit, remember, they called in somebody who could play music because Saul was going through whatever mental anguish he was going through. And we understand this to be not just the first of his acts, but the foremost of them. David's music defines him, who he is. And in the narrative, he's worthy of the king's attention. And in tradition, he's worthy of God's and our affection. In the second episode of David's youth, now after you go through the book of Psalms, is of course the slaying of the Philistine giant Goliath. And it's quite a different picture of who David is compared to the David who is the sweet psalmist, the sweet songwriter of Israel. The David who plays the lyre is a young man at peace. But the David who faces Goliath is a young man very much at war. David, the musician, is sedentary amid the chaos of Saul's court. And David, the warrior, is by contrast full of motion amid the static face-off between the two armies. The Israelites and the Philistines are dug in on either side of this valley of Elah, with Goliath stepping out day after day to challenge any Israelite to face him in single combat. No one moves. David journeys from his home, arrives into this repeating set piece, and he speaks with Saul and rejects the heavy armor that prevents him from moving freely and runs forward to encounter Goliath out in the open valley. And some said that Saul offered him his armor because Saul wanted everybody to think it was him out there. Of course, that would have rippled through the army anyway, but this is one of the thoughts that's given. And remember, it says that Saul, when he was chosen as king, he stood head and shoulders above everyone else. So I don't know how tall he was, but he was a big guy. And so they put his armor on David, and it said it didn't fit. David thought it was cumbersome. He says, no, look, he says, God's my armor. I'm going to go out there. And David is all in this story. He's courage. He's nobility embodied. And though only a youth at the time, not a little boy, as all the stories make you think, and have depicted over the years, he was a young man. He was a youth, probably in his late teens, maybe even almost 20 years old. He was just happened to be the youngest son. That's why he was the one left home to tend the sheep. And though he was only this youth, he proves himself to be the biggest man on the battlefield. And this nobility finds expression in the most famous and beloved image of David, and that's Michelangelo's glorious sculpture. Look it up as we're talking about it. Michelangelo's sculpture of David. If you have never seen it, once you see it, you'll recognize it. And it's ironic that this story of David's bold movements is most effectively captured by a motionless figure in this statue. As evocative as the image of the stone sinking into Goliath's forehead might be, the picture that stays with us is that of David taking a stand, slingshot in hand, with not a shred of fear in his eyes. We may not ever have to face down a giant in a one-on-one combat like that. But everyone knows the feeling of confronting that which is terrifying. And David's self-possession in the face of grave danger stands as its lasting example for all of us. And this is undoubtedly why, folks, despite the fact that David was at war nearly his entire life, this is the first battle that lasts in the imagination. For this is virtually the only time that David is not in a position where he holds some degree of power. Only here does he stand alone against the odds. It's a David and Goliath story. Quoting Carl, the groundskeeper in Caddyshack. But perhaps even more significantly, David's stance is not one of pure bravery, but rather of the bravery that comes from a deeply held trust in God's power. He steps out there. Remember that passage? We read it, I don't know when we did, very recently, either last Friday. Let's see, David and Goliath in Samuel. I want to look this up because I want to read this little tiny bit again so you can see what David said again. It says, now here's the passage. It says, now the Philistines gathered their forces for war and assembled. This is 1 Samuel 17. And they pitched a camp at Ephraim between Soko and Azekah. And Saul and the Israelites assembled and encamped in the valley of Elah and drew up their battle line to meet the Philistines. And the Philistines occupied one hill and the Israelites another, with the valley between them. And a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits in a span, roughly, by today's measurements, 9 foot to 9.5 feet tall. He had a bronze helmet on his head, wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went ahead of him. Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. And if he's able to fight and kill me, we'll become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistines said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." And on hearing the Philistines' words, King Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. Now, the music changes now. Now David was the son of an Ephraimite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was very old. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second Abinadab, and the third Shammah. And David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. So for 40 days, the Philistine came forward every morning and every evening and took his stand. Now Jesse said to his son David, "Take this ephah of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread for your brothers and hurry to their camp. Take along these 10 cheeses to the commander of their unit and see how your brothers are and bring back some assurance from them. They are with Saul, and all the men of Israel are in the valley of Elah fighting against the Philistines." So early in the morning, David left the flock, and in the care of a shepherd, he loaded up and set out as Jesse had directed, reached the camp as the army was going out to its battle positions. Valley of Elah is not all that far from Bethlehem. And so Israel and the Philistines were drawing up their lines and facing each other. David left his things with the keeper of supplies, ran to the battle lines, and asked his brothers how they were. And as he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, stepped out from his lines and shouted his usual defiance, and David heard it. Whenever the Israelites saw the man, they all fled from him in great fear. Now, why didn't somebody just take him out with an arrow? I don't know. But now the Israelites had been saying, "Do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage, and he will exempt his family from taxes in Israel." So David asked the men standing near him, "What's going to be done for the man who kills the Philistine and removes his disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Now, that's not a little boy saying that. That's the young man who's left at home to tend the flocks while his brothers all go to fight. And they repeated to him what they had been saying and told him, "This is what will be done for the man who kills him." And when Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking with the man, he burned with anger at him and asked, "Why have you come down here, David? And who did you leave those few sheep with in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." "Now what have I done?" said David. "Can't I even speak?" He then turned away to someone else and brought up the same matter. And the men answered him as before. What David said was overheard and repeated to Saul, and Saul sent for him. David said to Saul, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant, me, I'll go and fight him." And Saul replied, "You're not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You're only a young man, and he's been a warrior since his youth." So, by the way, that erases for me any notion that Goliath was stricken with giantitis or sickly and grown over tall and stuff like that. He's just a big guy. The Bible calls him a remnant of the Nephilim. That's interesting, huh? So David said to Saul, "Your servant's been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came near and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it. I struck it, rescued the sheep from its mouth. Then when it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it." I don't know if he's bragging a little bit. That's pretty awesome to grab a lion by its hair or a bear and kill it. So, your servant has killed both lion and bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paws of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. Saul said to David, "Go, God be with you." Then Saul dressed David in his own tunic. He put a coat of armor on him and a bronze helmet on his head. And David fastened on the sword over the tunic and tried walking around because he was not used to them. "I can't go in there in these," he said to Saul, "because I'm not used to them." So he took them off. Then he took off his staff. He took his staff in his hand, chose 5 smooth stones from the stream, put them in the pouch of his shepherd's bag, and with his sling in hand, he approached the Philistine. Meanwhile, the Philistine, with his shield bearer in front of him, kept coming closer to David. He looked David over, and he saw that he was little more than a boy, glowing with health and handsome, and he despised him. He said to David, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. "Come here," he said, "boy, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and the wild animals." David said to the Philistine, now this is pretty bold. If this is all true of how this happened, it's pretty bold, because David says, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. And this day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down, and I'll cut off your head." MFer is what you almost want to hear him saying at that point. "And this very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. And all those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give all of you into our hands." Now, I got to say, spoken only like a young man who is a lyricist. He knew how to use words. So as the Philistine moved closer to attack him, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag, taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. And that's it. That's the climax of that battle. Zoop, 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 whoosh. Poof, into his forehead. Slam. Down. Done. Over. So David ran quickly toward the let's see, I read that part. And David ran and stood over him. He took hold of the Philistine's sword and drew it from the sheath. After he killed him, he cut off his head with the sword. And when the Philistines saw that their hero was dead, they turned and ran. Then the men of Israel and the Judah surged forward with a shout and pursued the Philistines to the entrance of Gat and to the gates of Ekron. Their dead were strewn along the Sharim road to Gat and Ekron. When the Israelites returned from chasing the Philistines, they plundered their camp, and David took the Philistines' head and brought it to Jerusalem, and he put the Philistines' weapons into his own tent, and so on. And then the story goes from there. It says he took the head to Jerusalem. David didn't conquer Jerusalem for another 13 years. That tells you a little something of the time gap that's going on right there. So that's the interesting and I think very amazing story of David and Goliath and this confrontation. And so where are we supposed to take this from here? David stands alone against the odds. And perhaps even more significantly, his stance is not one of pure bravery, but rather the bravery that comes from a deeply held trust in God's power. His speech to Goliath ranks as one of the greatest declarations of faith in the face of adversary, worthy of any Sophoclean or Shakespearean monologue of any kind. And hold on, I lost my place in my notes here. There it is. You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts. And I read that whole passage to you. It's a thrilling statement. And it further opens the story to readers in any desperate situation. If anyone can emulate David's stance, you can conquer over the giants in your life. The application. Now, if David's playing the lyre, here's an image of faith expressed in words. David defeating Goliath is this image of faith expressed in action. So words and action from David. So taken together, they represent a complete picture of the authentic man of God, one as emotionally insightful as he is physically courageous. And all the parts of his character are testifying to his devotion. David stands as a model for all who pray and act in God's name. This is the defining stories of a character's youth, and they're more valuable than birth narratives. The story of a character's birth imbues that figure with a sense of predestination for greatness, with an otherworldly quality that adds the character's glow. And at the same time, however, birth stories are distancing for the reader, for there's no possibility of emulating them. By the time one reads this story, after all, it's too late to imitate it. But when characters emerge from an unremarkable background and define themselves by their own actions, the reader has a visceral reaction. Here is something I could do. I could do this too. Someone I could aspire to be. And it's not a coincidence that many of our modern heroes are defined not by their birth stories, but by some relatively youthful experience, whether legendary or true. George Washington admitting to chopping down the cherry tree, John F. Kennedy saving his crew at sea during the Second World War. The character traits we associate with our heroes are frequently sought and found in the defining stories of who they became as men of action in their youth. Now, notably, especially for our purposes, this remains the case even when our heroes conduct themselves later in life in less than heroic ways, which David did. We downplay Kennedy's marital infidelities in favor of his marital exploits. We're like, hey, he bagged Marilyn Monroe. Go JFK. And we overlook the, what's the word I'm looking for? The philandering of it. Because he's a hero in other ways. David with the lyre and David facing the giant. These are the very first stories that we read about David in the Bible. And they're also the first stories about him that we learn as children. Not because they are first in the text, nor because they're about a young man, but because they instill the fundamental values of faith. And for many, these are, in fact, the only stories we know about David. And why would we need any others? Everything anyone could want in a hero, in a king, in an ancestor of the Messiah is present in this story. The David we meet in the first two chapters of his story is the David of our cultural memory, the David we hold on to in popular imagination. And yet, despite their cultural resonance, despite the values they encapsulate, despite the complete picture of the faithful hero they paint, when we try to read these two stories as a narrative history of David's youth, something is fundamentally askew. To put it bluntly, both stories cannot be true as they are told in the Bible. That's a pretty bold statement of me, don't you think? Not both of these stories, these versions of David, can be true as they're told in the pages of Scripture. So we've got David's dueling origins. The narrative in 1 Samuel 16 of David playing the lyre for Saul, on its own terms, is relatively straightforward. We're first introduced to David when the prophet Samuel goes to anoint one of Jesse's sons secretly as king. We meet Jesse and David's brothers, each of whom is rejected in turn. And finally, David is found, having been brought in from shepherding the flock, and Samuel duly anoints him. And David is seized by the divine spirit from that day forward. Meanwhile, Saul's spirit is troubled. His courtiers suggest finding someone who might play the lyre to make Saul feel better. And one of the young men immediately thinks of David. I've seen a son of Jesse the Bethlehemite who is skilled in music, a man of valor, a warrior, sensible in speech, a handsome man, and the Lord is with him. So Saul promptly sends for David, who comes as asked, and Saul finds David pleasing, anoints the lad as one of his arms bearers, sending word to Jesse that he intends to keep David with him. And so we're told whenever Saul felt the evil spirit descend on him, that David played his lyre and the spirits would depart from Saul. Now, this is all well and good until we begin to read the story of David and Goliath in the next chapter. Suddenly, it's as if the previous story had never happened. I wondered about that before I even thought about this kind of thing. Why are these stories? Wasn't he already in Saul's presence? And so we're again introduced to the family of David in terms that make it clear that they are being introduced for the first time. David was the son of a certain Ephrathite of Bethlehem in Judah, whose name was Jesse. And so a certain Ephrathite whose son was Jesse. This is the way the Bible regularly introduces new characters. But Jesse is hardly a new character. Why should he be introduced again? And we're told he had 8 sons, but again, we already knew this from the previous chapter. Furthermore, the names of his 3 sons who had gone to battle were Eliab, the firstborn, Abinadab, and the third was Shammah. And David was the youngest. Not only did we already know that David was the youngest, we already knew the names, the birth order of his 3 eldest brothers. In fact, we know them relatively well, since it was precisely these 3 whom Samuel rejected in the previous story. And it would be one thing if the second story gave us the names of the other 4 sons, but it doesn't. And so there's a bit of new information here. What's more, both stories use the eldest brothers in the same way, as a foil for David. In the first story, they're explicitly rejected by Samuel. In the second, they're among those who stand by while Goliath challenges the Israelites to fight, and they even get kind of pissed off at David. Then there's a question of where David is when the second story begins. We learned in the previous chapter that Saul had taken him into his service as an arms bearer. Since Saul was now out on the battlefield, surely David should be with him, bearing his arms. But no, he's back home with Jesse, and he goes to the battlefield only to bring food to his brothers. It's his only purpose. He's even supposed to go right back home with news of how his brothers are faring. So admittedly, the second story seems to recognize this confusion about how David spends his time. And so we're told that David would go back and forth from attending on Saul to shepherd his father's flock at Bethlehem. But even this explanation is scarcely acceptable. Are we to imagine that during peacetime, David was in constant attendance on Saul as an arms bearer, but during a time of war, he was there only occasionally? So furthermore, the narrative doesn't really match with his back and forth movement between Saul and Jesse. And when David goes to the battlefield, it's not to attend on Saul at all. but to only check on his brothers. And it's clear that this is, in fact, David's first time going to the battle, since when he sees Goliath, here's the giant's challenge, which has been going on for 40 days at this point. He seems to have no idea that this has been going on for the last 40 days. All of which is to say that the verse stating that David went regularly between Jesse and Saul, it's not only illogical, but it stands as fairly clear evidence that the discrepancies between the two stories were felt even by the biblical authors, who made a half-hearted and transparent attempt to reconcile them in those verses. But from there, the problems only grow. When David goes to Saul, declares his intention to fight Goliath, Saul's response is, in light of the previous story, rather surprising. You are only a boy, and he has been a warrior from his youth. This can hardly be the same David who was introduced to Saul in the previous chapter as a man of valor, a warrior. David then describes himself entirely in terms of his career as a shepherd. Your servant has been tending his father's sheep, he introduces himself. Although surely he would have said that he had been Saul's arm bearer. Do you think, why didn't he introduce himself that way? I'm your arms bearer, remember me? So the disconnect between the two stories comes to a head at the end of 1 Samuel 17 when Saul saw David going out to confront the Philistine. He said to Abner, the army commander, "Whose son is that boy, Abner?" This question is, by any reckoning, inconceivable. Saul took David into his service in the previous chapter. And David was especially pleasing to Saul. Saul appointed him his personal arms bearer. David regularly played the lyre to soothe Saul's spirit. So Saul even communicated directly with Jesse. How could he now not know who David is? Only when we reach this unfathomable question do we realize that nowhere in the second story has Saul addressed David by name, nor has David offered it. It seems that to Saul, David is just a youth who has volunteered to fight. And only when he's successful does it occur to the king to discover who the lad might be. But we should have known, and we all should have known very well. We are at the end of our radio time. I'm going to do one quick out and come back in. We're going to finish this, folks. If you're on the radio, come over to the YouTube channel, youtube.com/Scotty Roberts. So we can finish this story for you tonight. We're just going to go right through. So I'm going to play the exit, and then we're going to come right back in. So everybody who's there on the radio, live long and prosper. Come and join us in the chat room.
Join us every weeknight at 9 p.m. Central Standard Time, 10 p.m. Eastern. The Intrepid radio program. A Scotty Roberts Productions broadcast.
All right, guys, we're back. We have just said good night to the radio audience. Now we've just got you over on the YouTube channel. Let me finish this little part of the story, and then we'll go over into the captain's cabin officially after that. So we are at the point of saying the conclusion of the Goliath story is to be found in the first verses of the next chapter, 1 Samuel 18, where we read that Saul took David into his service that day and would not allow him to return to his father's house. And with this, the parallel nature of the two stories is fully revealed. Both begin with no foreknowledge of who David is, such that we have to be introduced to him and to his family, his father, his three eldest brothers, and his four unnamed brothers. Both describe how David comes to Saul's attention through his skill at playing the lyre and through his bravery on the battlefield. Both have Saul being pleased with David because he soothes Saul's spirit and because he is victorious against Goliath. And both conclude with the explicit notice that David Saul took David into his permanent service, thereby severing David from his home in Bethlehem. So in short, what we have in these two different chapters are two different stories of David's rise to prominence in Saul's court. Now, could you take these and craft the single story and make some assumptions? Go, well, maybe this happened and that. Sure, there's a lot of things that could be creatively done to this to rewrite this and make it all meld together or fill in the gaps. But that's not what the text says, is the problem. So the two stories are identical in function. They're parallel in structure, but they're thoroughly incompatible as sequential episodes in an historical narrative. And the parallel and the independent existence of the two different accounts, remarkably, is proved by the evidence of the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible from the 3rd century BCE, the Septuagint, the Septuaginta, if you want to call it that. That's the Bible, the Old Testament we have today is the Septuagint, translated to English, if you're an English speaker. For in the Greek text of 1 Samuel 17, huge chunks of the Goliath story that we know from the Hebrew Bible are missing. And those chunks are precisely the ones that contain almost all of the contradictions with 1 Samuel 16 that we just noted. 16 and 17 are the two chapters in the two stories. And so the Hebrew version preserves a fully separate account of David's defeat of Goliath, one that likely circulated independently, hence its reintroduction of the main characters. Its distinctive description of David, its ignorance of David's established relationship with Saul, and the structural part of the parallels with 1 Samuel 16, only at a much later point was this independent story of David's victory over Goliath combined with the alternative story found in the Septuagint, thereby creating the literary mess that I just told you about. That's the canonical text of 1 Samuel 16 through 17. Now, we have two independent and truly irreconcilable stories about how David emerged from obscurity to become a presence in the royal court of Saul. Now, it's easy enough to see why both would be valuable to the biblical authors. And as we've already seen, both of these stories present David in a flattering light as a young man, faithful to both his king and his God. But both cannot be historically true, for they contradict each other at almost every turn. And these contradictions illustrate one of the main difficulties with reading the Bible as history. The Bible preserves disparate and frequently irreconcilable traditions, even about a single figure like David, a single guy. These traditions may have great value from a theological perspective, and after all, what is the Bible? It's nothing if it's not a theological work, but they cannot provide us with firm grounds for historical reconstruction. And so in a situation like that, presented by these two chapters, we're forced to make a decision as to which tradition seems more likely to have any historical value. A decision that we can only make on the basis of a close analysis of each tradition independently. So unfortunately, to say, when we look closely at these two famous biblical traditions about David as the musically gifted author of the Psalms and as the uniquely courageous slayer of Goliath, we find that not only can both not be historically true, but in fact, hang on to your butts, neither is historically true, while David remains a real person in history. And that's where we're going to leave off with that story. And there's more about who slew the giant and stuff. We're going to get to that in another episode of this. And next time we're going to talk about him being the author of the Psalms with a big question mark after it. Author of the Psalms? Really? So now let's get out of here. We're going to go to break. And good night, Barbie D. She says, good night, radio audience. You may still be here. So let's take a little break, and we'll come right back with the Captain's Cabin. And it seems attendance was very low tonight. So if you're out there and you want to come into the Captain's Cabin, come on in. Otherwise, we'll just see. We may have a shorter Captain's Cabin depending on level of people that want it to be here. So that's it. So stand by. We're going to go out to break. You sit there. We will be back in just a couple of minutes. Stand by. Out we go. Hey folks, this is Scotty Roberts, and this is the Intrepid radio broadcast. I've been broadcasting for about 20 years now, covering such topics as science, politics, the paranormal, weird science, weird world history, archaeology, and the paranormal. Everything from ghosts to cryptids to creepy things that go bump in the night. So every week I bring you 3 new episodes. Come and join my channel and also be a patron to this site. So see the details below, and we'll see you here.
Dave, I love you, brother.
I miss you too.
I miss you too, I heard.
Yep,
Did you guys hear that?
I heard that.
I miss you, Dave.
Hey, folks, welcome back. This is the Captain's Cabin. And welcome back. And Matthew, you did say something toward the end of the show. You talked about the Elhanan theory. We're not going to talk about that tonight. We're going to bring that up in another show because I want to present that in its full glory rather than as a footnote or an afterthought to what we just talked about. But folks, the David and Goliath story, there's a lot more there than meets the eye. We're going to hit that later in this series in context. And so we'll talk about that a bit later. And yes, that is a nice clip of Uncle Dave. And so it's always good to hear that. It's refreshing to me. But there's something about the origins of David. And this is where you start to get a sense that this story, there's more to it than meets the eye, and maybe even a little less to it than meets the eye. There's contradictions. What do you do with these? Is this story of David a pure and simple apologetic, which is what was done in the day? Can the God of heaven use an apologetic? Yeah, I think he can. He wants to. So, and obviously has over the years, but trying to root out this historical David is kind of tough. And you'll find out even more as we continue to go through this story of David. There's a lot more to it. So, folks, I think what I'm going to do, I'm going to wind this show up. We're going to make it a short one tonight. Captain's Cabin, we're just kind of doing a touch and go here. We will be back. What is tomorrow? Tomorrow is Thursday. Wendy and I have had a rough time getting together to do Robertson the last few weeks. If you've noticed, it's been missing from the roundup, even though we keep announcing it. Wendy has been going through some sketchy health issues. It's just got her down. And I've had some of my own stuff. Nothing major, nothing like I'm not sick and sick gonna die or anything like that. But I've been really extremely tired out lately. Just an exhaustion level. I don't know what's causing it. And, some people say you're just getting older. And I hate to succumb to that being the only reason that I'm tired a lot. But I have attributed some of it to my eyes. I had the eye surgery done. And I'm now almost a month out from having had the second eye done. And the first eye, I'm 6 weeks out from that. So hopefully it's all healed up. The only thing I've noticed, you ever notice this? If your eyes feel really dry or really tired out, your whole face is going to feel tired. Your whole body's going to feel tired because you want to shut your eyes. So let's see. If I can survive a damn tornado today, and stream, anyone can. There you go. There you've got your reason to stream, field guy. You survived a tornado. Right on. We get those up here every now and then. Every summer. I remember the worst one I can think of. I was in college. This was Owatonna, Minnesota. And we had 13 tornadoes come through that night. And there were alarms sounding all night and all kinds of bad stuff going on. So that was out in the country, and I don't think anybody was injured. There was some damage done, but 13 tornadoes touched down that night. And now we're getting into what they're predicting to be a very hot summer up here. Hot, and they're already talking like, oh, our humidity is going to go up by this weekend, which means it's already starting. That hot, humid. We're going right from a non-winter up here into a very warm summer. And so it was 70 degrees today, maybe a little bit over. And after being so cold the last 10 days, but then it was in the 70s before that. So we've had a really odd winter, a warm winter. Let's put it that way. This cold front that normally comes in here. Here I'm going to sound like a weather guy. The cold front that comes in from here, from northwest Canada, and comes swooping down into the plain states of the Dakotas and over into Minnesota and Wisconsin over here. That's the way our weather pattern generally comes down. We get those Arctic blasts, we get the blizzards, all of that, our snow comes all across the plain states and into where we live, north central United States. And but it seems to have come down out of the northwest, and it just kind of it splits. It's kind of like it splits and it goes around the whole swath of area that covers Minneapolis, St. Paul area, my area east of there. And we just have not had the snow. It's been an overly warm winter. And no snow. We had snow before Christmas, and we didn't have snow again until the whole winter. And it all melted off around the new year, but we had snow again not until March, beginning of March, which is odd because we generally have 70 to 80 inches accumulated snow by that time, and we had nothing on the ground. So now we're all no snow on the ground. It's warm. It's in the 70s. It'll be in the 70s again all through the weekend, and sunshine, and we'll see where it all goes from there. They're talking about rains. Now the rains are going to be coming. So the spring rains. So it could get a little sloggy around here over the next week or so, if all goes like they say. So, as Sleet, your hippy dippy weatherman, all your weatherman. Al Sleet or AI Sleet, your hippy dippy. I'm not sure where you're going with that, field guy, but yeah, what you say. Above average heat waves for the summer. That's right. And of course, our weather guy just this morning on the TV, local guy, they were talking, the newscasters, of course, all the friendly little chit chat and banter going on with between the anchors and the weather guy, and they have their morning show thing going, and he was they were talking about the anchors. Well, the Farmer's Almanac says it's going to be a really hot winter or summer. And the weather guy goes, well, yeah, I hate to burst that bubble. He says, but the Farmer's Almanac said this last winter was supposed to be cold and snowy, which we had just the opposite. So he says, it's really hard to tack a model on weather that's going to, all we can do is go by probabilities. He says, the probability is that it's going to be warm. We don't know for sure yet until it happens. Oh, the George Carlin skit. Got it. Now, like I said, there's a whole 8 of us here in the chat room. And there are other people listening, but now we don't have the radio audience, and it generally jumps a little bit. And I am exhausted enough that I am going to call it a day. We're going to wrap up this here Captain's Cabin. And I hate to say, oh, it's just because I'm exhausted. Remember when we started the Captain's Cabin? I said it's going to be about a 10 to 15 minute thing after every show. And it's going to be an average of about an hour. And sometimes we get into an hour and a half to 2 hours. And sometimes it's really exciting and fun. Great conversation. Other times it's like pulling teeth because we're at the end of the day. We're at the end of everything. So 8 would be a lot in my streams, says Field Guy. Well, everybody can go over to Field Guy's stream. He's going to do a stream. If you want to go hop on over there, Field Guy will leave his where to find him. I think you can just click on his name in the chat room, and you can go over and see his stream. As for me right now, I'm going to get out of here. I'm going to make like a tree and get out of here. The mixed metaphor thing going on there. That's from Back to the Future. You remember that. So until maybe tomorrow with Wendy, we'll see how she's doing tomorrow. Might do a Robertson at 4 p.m. Central, 5 p.m. Eastern. And we will do this show again on Friday. We'll either continue with David, or we will maybe hit a ghosty topic and then hit David back up on next Monday. We'll see how it goes. We'll see where I go with all of that. So as for right now, I want to thank you all for being here. Thank you for giving me your time. Thanks for being here. And I'll keep you updated on this ghost investigation that's coming up with Rainey and I, where we want to make sure we do some filming and maybe bring you in on it a little bit. So that's just a tease for what's yet to come. So all of you, thank you for being part of this show. Live long and prosper.